It is now 2 years since San Francisco's COVID-19 lockdown began. Before the lockdown, the streets looked like this. But by late March 2020, the outside was otherworldly, still and quiet. My response was like many others. I imagined the outside as a place of a deadly virus. I feared the outside. Yet the inside was safe, or was it? Could I go out and get my mail in the building's mailroom? Or would I contaminate my office just by coming back in? Many of the condominium complexes in San Francisco have surveillance cameras. The system in my building lets us see the cameras directly from our smartphones, and we can see what has happened up to 2 days earlier. A common date and timestamp is applied to all camera footage. Confined inside, I started to look out at the outside through surveillance cameras. I could now see events over long spans of time, or replay events and drill into details missed at first. It is 1:05 in the afternoon in June. Two folks come by, one dragging a sofa and drops it in front of my office. They make themselves at home. One of them leaves. The person carefully folds up their extra clothing, putting it into a bag. The person stands and walks away. The sofa has been left. Those who brought it do not appear to consider it theirs, but rather something to use and then leave. 3 hours later, a new couple arrives. But wait, it's the same two people, but they have changed their outer clothing. There are more changes of clothes, smoking and chilling as pedestrians pass by. After half an hour, they leave. "10 minutes later, a couple walks by, the guy gesturing at the sofa and its accumulated debris. Minutes later, a fellow pushing a cart sees the sofa and takes a rest. He begins to examine some of the contents of his cart fastidiously. It is 5 p.m., 4 hours after the sofa arrived. The man and his cart walks away in the direction from which he came. At 6 p.m., an energetic person rides their electric scooter by and sees an opportunity. Getting the sofa on the scooter takes some tinkering. Deciding which side of the sofa to put up front. Centering the sofa on the scooter, the person finally rides away under electric power. All in all, the sofa came and went in 5 hours. So what has happened? Here's my take. You might have your own. To the initial couple, the sidewalk was fair game for their use in creating a comfortable place for rest, arranging and accumulating clothing, and chatting. For the man with the cart, the sofa presented an unexpected opportunity to relax and fiddle with stuff. Inside, I was angry at the prospect of having to get the sofa away from my office to prevent gatherings of people throughout the night who might talk and keep me awake. To the two passerbys, the sofa and its debris may have represented yet another example of irresponsible homelessness on the streets. And to the scooter person, the sofa was a wonderful, unanticipated find. When I first moved to the south of Market in San Francisco in the 2000s, I noticed folks you might call neighborhood homeless. These were people who lived on the streets, often inhabiting the same spots year after year. But by the start of COVID, they were no longer around. This is Modesto. He was a homeless person who hung out near my friend Lynn's place several blocks from me. In 2018, I went to my area's major vegetarian food market, Rainbow Grocery. Folks coming in told me about a fellow who had had his cardboard sign up asking for money. A speeding car turned, went out of control, hitting Modesto. Later I realized that my friend Lynn had written about Modesto in his book, My Homeless Neighbors, Conversations from the Streets of San Francisco. This is what Lynn wrote. I was walking home, and as I passed Modesto's corner, he yelled, "Hey, buy me some alcohol, motherfucker." I cracked up. Modesto had been asking me to buy him alcohol for half a decade at this point, and I never had. He shouted again, "Why are you laughing, motherfucker?" He started laughing too. Later, a mutual friend recounted to me, it was hit and run. Drunk guy leaving a club did 70 miles per hour through a stoplight. Someone chased him onto the freeway while calling the cops, and they blocked off the roads and caught him. He paused. His body flew, just flew. I thought about this frail old man's body lifting into the air. I hoped his life had flown from him. Modesto had had his first wife in Florida. In San Francisco, he got married again, but he worked 3 jobs, all day, every day. His wife started sleeping with someone else because he was working all the time. That was what broke him. He felt like there was nothing he could do right.
Oh, someone else was sleeping in Modesto's blankets. But you were and then I saw you and I was like, oh, did someone take your blankets?
Oh, nobody sleep. That deal there for somebody. Think about it, somebody there.
Returning from gay bars at night in late 2017, I became aware of a homeless man who kept to himself here at the entrance to the AIDS Health Project. He was never stoned and would read books to pass the time. At night, he put a 30-inch high barrier of cardboard between himself and the sidewalk. He told me it deterred people who might otherwise rob or stab him. He was a stocky white man in his 70s with a full beard and mustache, living on his Social Security and veterans benefits. His major expenses were rent and VA meds. The Trump administration had significantly reduced his VA benefits, so he could not afford both. City services got him into a hotel, but his racial disagreements with the hotel's director meant that he slept on the street at various times. I started to talk with him at the onset of COVID. I asked why he chose to sleep in the entryway. He told me he used to frequent the nearby gay bars and knew the area was safe. He asked for socks, which I brought him. He did not like masks. He had just left the hotel, ready to hop a bus to Los Angeles where his buddies waited for him. But he was stuck as the interstate bus systems were not running due to the first COVID lockdown. By summer, he was gone. I hope he made it to Los Angeles. Near me, the neighborhood homeless person was Casey. For over a decade, I slowly became aware of Casey, who would hang out on my street off and on. I would understand that he would frequent many places in the same way. And in most of those places, he befriended some of the people in each area over the years that he lived on the street. One night, in the fall of 2019, I ran into Casey on a street corner smiling. I said, "Hey Casey, you look happy." And he reached around his backpack and showed me a new teddy bear, suggesting that that was why he was so happy. Casey loved teddy bears. Increasingly over the years, he talked to and for his teddy bears. The teddies had elaborate stories assigned to their lives and personalities. Casey asked for money, and I was glad to give it to him. Months earlier, he had been assaulted and robbed. His assailants had taken money as well as his favorite big stuffed teddy that he called Bear. Some of his friends, including the homeless outreach of a major corporation nearby, put out posters seeking Bear's return. That night on the street corner was the last time I would see Casey. Within a month, he died of a fentanyl overdose crouched in the recessed front of a local shop early one morning. I never really thought of Casey as a drug addict. When we talked, he was usually coherent and present. After he died, I learned he had a meth habit, and fentanyl is insidious because it is cheap and it can complement two different kinds of drugs: speed drugs like meth and opiates like heroin and oxycodone. Minor changes in fentanyl dosages can mean the difference between life and death. Casey's friends organized a memorial for him in a nearby garden. Casey had been a San Franciscan for decades. He moved with his girlfriend wife into the burgeoning punk rock scene at the Vats in the early 1990s. He was in his 20s. The Vats were part of an abandoned brewery a mile away. After his wife left him, Casey lived on couches and eventually moved onto the streets. He would return home to the Midwest every few years, and every time, like a few months before he died, his mother would ask him to stay, and he would reply that he found the streets of San Francisco softer than the bed at home. One morning in 2019, I was woken by scuffling outside. I heard a police interrogation. When I stuck my head out, I saw two men lying on a blanket on the sidewalk. The man on the left had apparently been giving a blowjob to the other, who was not at all keen about it. A bit later, I went outside and chatted with the man on the right who remained. He seemed no older than 28 years old and was quite handsome. He did not fit my stereotype of a homeless man. He seemed a scruffy version of the young techies that now populate San Francisco. He gathered his stuff, though this was difficult as he was quite stoned. I asked him, "What are you on?" And he said, "Fentanyl." I said, "You know, that can kill you." And he replied, "Yes, I know." I asked him how he came to live on the streets. He said 3 years earlier he, his wife, and their newborn baby lived in the western part of San Francisco. One day, his wife took their child and jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. In despair, he moved onto the streets. I never saw this man again. 4 years ago, I became aware of a lady sleeping across the street. She reappeared there several days later on a very chilly night. I gave her a Mylar space blanket to make her sleeping a bit warmer. A couple of weeks later, she camped out right in front of my door and looked in for stuff. This happened several times over the following weeks, but by then I was ignoring her requests and she moved away from my door. On one of those days, she was in a loud discussion on her cell phone. Peering out, I realized that there was no cell phone. She was having an imaginary conversation with her mother and replying in different voices, animating her monologue. On another night, she and a man were huddled together. She told him she liked her orgasms on heroin. She seemed to be negotiating her price for sleeping with him. I never saw this lady again after 2018. These stories go counter to the widely held sense that the strange people living on San Francisco streets are not San Franciscans. As we have seen, some have lived here longer than most of my neighbors who moved to San Francisco from all over the world only within the past few years of this last decade. Modesto and the veteran were hardy people. They had their reasons for coming to San Francisco years ago. Perhaps a new place to start over. Perhaps a place more accommodating to their sexuality. They made the best out of what they had. For a long-time homeless, years of suffering can be set aside for a part of a day. Some drug use can touch a deep reality impossible to attain in normal life. Problems can seem solved or disappear. Self-esteem may be enhanced. Physical pain disappear. I have had experience with some of these drugs. My experience with fentanyl comes from 2 periods of hospital recovery from major surgery. It was an amazing drug for pain and mood. Yet drugs can be addictive and destructive to mind and body. So sustained drug use becomes more than a diversion from suffering. It becomes a part of that suffering. With the start of COVID, the streets became dead quiet. No longer were people going and coming to work, going and coming out to the dance halls, restaurants and bars, and in the process masking the homeless moving in the background. With COVID's quiet, the homeless emerged as the new foreground. A lady fastidiously cleans up tiny plastic and paper particles spread when she and her friends smoked drugs earlier. She raises her hands in victory. The surveillance cameras began to show the momentary behavior of very stoned folks, in some cases in combination with mental illness. The cameras caught a sidewalk that at times became a stage for very strange and extraordinary occurrences, albeit drug-fueled or mental illness-facilitated occurrences. It is October. Around midnight, the first major rainfall of the season begins. The air is filled with energetic negative ions. Perfect for a very stoned young man to walk the streets and sidewalks barefooted. On an August night, I am working at my computer playing a wonderful techno stream. I hear noise at my windows. I look on the surveillance cameras and see that a pretty stoned fellow is outside listening. He starts to dance. And he moves over to the tree to relax. But a bicyclist moves past fast just as I turn off my office music in order to focus my attention on what the surveillance cameras are showing me. The man gets back up and seems pissed at the bicyclist for interrupting his fun and stopping the music. He shuffles down the street. Early one morning, I am awoken by loud talking in the street. I put on my earplugs and go back to sleep. Later, when I awake, The surveillance cameras show a man walking down the middle of the street. He holds his smartphone, recording things that interest him. He becomes obsessed with art that has been stenciled on the sidewalk. The man spends over 2 hours pacing back and forth, looking at it and contemplating whatever it has brought up for him. Done, he walks down the street. I heard loud growling noises outside. The surveillance cameras show a man digging through the topsoil of the planter right outside my door. He carefully sifts through the dirt and puts it into his mouth. He goes over to the window of a parked car and, maybe using it as a mirror, seems to brush his teeth with the dirt. He does this many times over a period of 20 minutes. This is the planter and the scattered dirt after he has left. In late June 2020, the George Floyd murder had occurred. Protests erupted throughout the Bay Area and San Francisco. I started to run across a man with a cane who wandered the neighborhood muttering out loud his own tales of racial oppression, talking to no one in particular. Here he is passionately addressing the tree outside me. Two weeks later, around 2 a.m. in the night, two men settled in front of my office, eating and doing drugs. Soon they were high and passed out. With these men passed out on the sidewalk, the man with the cane wandered by, talking about how he had been set up for a crime he had not committed. He talked about the 17 years he had spent in prison. I was awake for this. I watched it in real time on the cameras. A chill ran through my body. I was witnessing a vivid commentary on American racial life. I was witnessing a momentary private revealing of different oppressions, passing oblivious to each other in the solitude of the night. In the early morning, the two guys were partially under a plastic tarp, one with his head in a box. They departed, leaving most of their gear behind. In a few hours, the Western Soma Commercial Business District cleanup folks, the CBD cleanup, cleared material evidence of what had gone down on the sidewalk, resetting the sidewalk for a new day. Before COVID, tent encampments with extended tent stays could be found in various parts of Western Soma. But by 6 months into the COVID period, these were vanishing, perhaps a consequence of the city moving tent occupants to shelter-in-tent camps or shelter-in-place hotels set up throughout the city. Yet, as the first year of COVID stretched on, I was becoming aware of tent fires in which a homeless tent would incinerate. One of the first I saw was reported on an app occurring a mile away with no one apparently injured. In another instance, I smelled something burning eating outside with friends at a taco parklet a block away. When I got back to my office, the surveillance cameras pointed at the alleyway at the rear of my building and caught the beginnings of a tent fire. A fire had started among the goods adjacent to this man's tent. Perhaps stoned and angry, he frantically tried to put out the paper fire by hitting it with his t-shirt. His tent itself caught fire. Things within his tent were blowing up. The police and fire department soon arrived. A month and a half later, an app notified me of a tent fire about 3 blocks away. Over the next few days, newspapers reported that the police had responded to a burnt tent. Instead of finding burnt goods, they found inside a body. The young man was well known and liked. The young man had grown up in a wealthy fundamentalist Midwest family of a Christian megachurch pastor. But he was gay. Broken, he had run away from home at age 16. By his early 20s, he had established a cleaning business with friends in San Francisco. A mutual friend wrote, "My impression was of a quick, though neurodiverse mind that had been broken down to a primal level through abuse and trauma, and that he had sought in various ways to medicate for his condition through substances that had resulted in significant chronic side effects." Another friend of mine had taken this picture 7 years earlier and wrote, "I am pretty sure he was doing heroin and thus inadvertently fentanyl. I don't see this formerly incredibly industrious kid self-immolating." Most folks in the city assume that many of the derelict homeless they see on the streets are possible thieves. But in the several cases of direct burglary captured by the surveillance cameras, thieves are quite different. They are extremely careful, move deliberately, and are cleverly unidentifiable to the cameras. It is 3:24 a.m. in September 2021. A couple walks back and forth in front of the building. Then they go directly to the lobby door at 3:26 a.m. At 3:30, without breaking glass or banging on doors, they pry open the door and pass on through. If you had seen them in the lobby, you might mistake them for residents. The taller man heads to the door to possibly block any incomers, and the lady walks on outside. The man stays and opens and collects mail from the other mailboxes. Out on the street, the lady sorts through the mail she has. She is joined by the man as they go through the second batch of mail. They leave, walking up the street. Mail theft accomplished in less than 20 minutes. 2 months later, I awake to the sound of broken glass. Looking at our cameras, I see a tall man wheeling a Recology bin full of wine bottles, with one having fallen out of the bin, breaking and spreading red wine across the sidewalk on a rainy night. He hurries on up the street fully masked, his hooded gear wet with rain. Later, I find out that the wine bar around the corner was robbed around 4 a.m. Their surveillance cameras filmed 2 people breaking in. I give them copies of our surveillance video of the breaking bottle. This will be a car break-in. As in the mail break-in, the car will be carefully cased out over a 60-minute period in the middle of the night hours, after the car has arrived. It begins at 8:20 p.m. on Tuesday night in March 2021. A couple parks their car, locking their car as seen from the flashing taillights. Holding some bags that they have taken out of the trunk, they walk down the street, staying the night with friends or at a local mini hotel. They must be from out of town, as they have left a lot of their belongings draped all over the interior of their seats, visible from the outside. 7 hours later, their car is cased by a male passerby for over an hour. He leans casually against the rear door, looking towards the sidewalk. Perhaps an easy position to have an alibi for walking away and checking to see if this triggers a car alarm. The passerby returns 5 minutes later, checking the car out again. About an hour later, he returns with a blue bag. "12 minutes later, he is back. Perhaps his blue bag holds a Slim Jim to slip into the window and open the car. Again, he leans against the rear door and he turns to look into the car. Though not caught on the camera, he manages to open the driver's door without setting off the alarm, climbs in and closes the door. A man walks by with a dog as the intruder remains inside the car. The man exits the car holding a tall red bag and tries to open the rear trunk. Unsuccessful, he cases out the rear seat's content and leaves. The couple returns to their car the next morning. The man notices that something is wrong as he looks in the rear window and opens the driver's seat door, spending a couple of minutes looking around inside. He opens the trunk, and I suppose noticing that nothing was taken there, they drive off. Two months before this, I awoke to terror and fear in the middle of the night. It was 5:58 on a dark, early morning Tuesday. I awoke to loud crashing noises out on the street. The crashing and banging lasted for a minute. A minute later, there was a loud bang at my studio window. Someone had just punched open my window. Later, I looked at the surveillance cameras. The interior lobby camera showed the lobby door being attacked. Someone is throwing something at its frosted glass. Holes are being created in the door. There were no exterior street views as that camera was not working. After the lobby door attack, a tall, skinny young man walks up from that area towards my studio. He bends down and does an energy exercise. Executes deliberate steps ending in a capoeira-like right foot punch into my window. He then goes back down the street and walks past the building on his way to Folsom Street. Momentarily, he returns, walking past the lobby back to my studio window. As he approaches my window, you can see him count steps with his left hand, and he swings and pushes in my window a second time. He throws in a half-used cup of Campbell's white clam chowder soup through the window and walks off. In the 16 years I have lived in my studio, no one has ever tried to break in. Looking at the lobby door, it seems that this fellow did not intend or was incapable of breaking the door to enter the lobby. This was either sport or intense anger or frustration or all of that. Later, I realized I had recorded the first punch of my window.
Hey, stop that! I'm asleep.
Wow. Want to trap someone else in a simulation, huh? Fuck this building.
The sound was recorded on a smartphone app I use to record my dreams. Here's the recording again. From my sleeping loft down into the darkness of my studio, I yell.
Hey, stop that!
The young fellow sneers and laughs. I yell back in the darkness,
I'm asleep.
and the fellow says,
Wow. Want to trap someone else in a simulation, huh? Fuck this building.
To me, this dialogue suggests that the fellow was quite stoned, probably a meth-related drug. The guy was very hyped up. He was angry and somehow hated this building. I have no idea who he was. He seemed not intent on breaking and entering, but rather breaking the building in anger. People in the building suggested that he may have been friends with a unit on an upper floor rented out by an owner to folks who were holding late-night parties with people coming and going at all hours. Perhaps he had been denied access. In the days that followed, I am scared, trying to get my head around the violence and the weird verbal exchange. I came to understand that this seems to have emanated from the young man's own fantasies. He was in a simulation, like in a computer game, invincible, physically annihilating his enemies, and here he had caught another person in this simulation. At the same time, I had encountered someone intruding into my private space, awakening me from sleep, seemingly intent on disrupting my office. I was in shock, and as I have done previously in reaction to personal shock, delved into the particulars of what had happened, looking at the cameras and taking pictures outside, distracting myself from my fears. Over the next few days, I did not sleep well and awoke at the same time each day, the same time that the simulation guy had punched in my window earlier. Over the past few years, I have developed a dream practice. I record my night dreaming and I have become fearful about outside conditions that might interrupt my dreaming and its recall. So my fear stemming from this break-in was intense. Soon that fear found a new outside source, a fellow I would come to know over the next year as AJ. A week after the break-in, I was awoken by loud shuffling and screaming out on the sidewalk. Looking at the cameras, I saw a tent with a person inside moving around while a Recology garbage truck was emptying the large metal garbage bins from the 100-unit condominium across the street. Later, when I looked at the camera recordings, I see a guy has set up his stuff right in front of my office in the late afternoon of the previous day. He seems to move around a lot. At 3:30 a.m., he comes out and scouts out the area around his tent, perhaps checking to see that things are safe. He re-enters his tent at 3:46 a.m. Within the next 2 hours, he is awakened and he screams at the garbage noise. The next morning, he remains in his tent, even when my building's cleaning staff is scrubbing the sidewalk around him. He comes back to his tent later that evening, bringing a bundle of tied-together foam strips. He puts them in his tent, perhaps under the blankets on which he sleeps. Wednesday morning, he spends about half an hour packing up his goods into his backpack and his shopping cart and leaves. A bit later, he returns and ties up the foam strips to the telephone pole. In the meantime, I have called the Soma CBD to come remove the strips as sidewalk debris. He returns a day later, setting up in the early evening. This time he has a different silvery-like tint. This time he does not awake or scream when Recology makes its early morning garbage run. Once again, people are cleaning around his tent, but he is not roused. He gets up at 1:15 p.m., packs up, and leaves. After another day, he shows up at the same spot around 3 p.m. He now has a green and white tint and places his shopping cart in it. He arrives back that evening with 2 plastic rods that let him set up his tent's projecting entry roof. At 11:44 p.m., lights are on in the tent. Loud banging and shuffling is going on inside. 6 hours later, tent lights are on again and loud noises emanate. After exiting the tent, he returns around 10 a.m. and an hour later takes 20 minutes to neatly pack up and leave. From the 3 visits in a week in mid-January 2021, I peg this guy as a resourceful paranoid. He scouts out his environment. He resourcefully gathers new elements and adds them to his tenting. Yet for whatever reason, he can awake from sleep screaming, whether prompted by a surprise garbage truck visit or other issues. Unlike many homeless, he returns to a place he knows, as he can trust it, knows what to expect around it. He seems to be asleep several hours after midnight until late morning, though he can go in and out several times during that time. And when he packs up, he picks up after himself. He fastidiously packs and arranges his own stuff. 4 months later, AJ arrives in late May 2021. He now has an even more elaborate setup. After an hour and a half, he leaves. It is super windy. His big tent blows around for several hours. I return to my studio, taking pictures of his tent just as AJ is returning right in back of me. We chat. He is a friendly-faced, rugged dude, maybe 30, 40 years old. He is pretty grimy. I tell him I saw a guy check out his tent while he was gone. He asks, "Was anything stolen?" I cannot answer this as I have no idea what he had in his tent. I tell him I hope he continues to be quiet at night as I work late and sleep late. He tells me he only keeps food and his sleep stuff in the tent. He will be leaving tomorrow at 4 p.m., he says. Then he asks me what I do, and I tell him I'm an architect. He says he can work construction and asks me if he can have a job he can work on. He returns a few hours later, sits outside reading and eating. Soon he starts packing up. A man comes by, hangs around, and AJ offers him some things. A second person hangs out and leaves AJ with a red jacket. Soon AJ is attaching 2 plastic rods that extend out the rear of his bike. The first person returns and AJ offers him more stuff and clothing from his stash. AJ works on the rods and attaches additional stuff on top of them. By 4:30 he is leaving, just as he said. He has left behind a cardboard box. Over the next hours, a number of people come by and pick through the box. By the next day, the clothing is gone, and all that remains from AJ's stash are some pots and covers and a dried up cup of cooked beans. From this visit and from my first conversation with him, I realized that one-on-one he is coherent and interactive. He does not appear to be addicted to substances. He seems to give things to people around him who he doesn't know. AJ shows up 3 months later around midnight in late August. He leaves in the afternoon. He comes back a week later, but this time in a different spot at the other end of my building amid similar bushes and trees. He stays only 6 hours, packs up, and bikes off. A few days later, he is back in front of my office. He is gone the next day. A month later, he returns in October, though this time he has only a tiny tent. He sets it up and his bike against my office wall, climbs in and goes to bed. I come out around noon and run into someone from my building and chat. As my neighbor walks away, I go over to the little tent. I give him some money. He says "doja," which is thank you in Cantonese. I ask him if he is Chinese. He says he can speak a bit of Cantonese, but that he is Cambodian, and he tells me his name is AJ. He came to the United States as a child. He has 2 relatives who live in the Bay Area. He talks about how people steal stuff from him, how he has lost tents and other items. Again, he is coherent and not on drugs. He seems open, though he seems to be getting a bit nervous, as we are not having the usual short, clipped word exchanges that characterize South of Market residences' verbal encounters with homeless folk. On the surface, he seems a likable guy. I say goodbye and walk to my local coffee house. 15 minutes later, AJ packs up and bikes off. A few weeks later, I meet and chat with the next-door neighbor. He is a construction supervisor for a Marin County electrical company, so he gets up early for work. He too has chatted with AJ. We have much the same impressions of AJ. If I know it is AJ outside sleeping, I now know that he does not harbor ill will towards me or probably anyone else. He was sleeping right up against my office wall, above which is the window that the gamer meth dude punched in earlier. With AJ, I feel no fear as I was trying to sleep, even though he can let out loud screams while sleeping. AJ returns 3 months later around 1:30 a.m. in January 2022. He heads up the street directly to the spot. He scouts the spot out. Setting up his tent, he places his cart as a porch through which to crawl into his tent. He goes in and falls asleep. He screams during his sleep. I am awakened by this. From the cameras, I realize it is AJ. I tell myself it's okay and I go back to sleep. But his further screams unnerve me. I decide, even though I trust him not to harm me and to clean up after himself, I have to put on earplugs to go to sleep. I go to sleep. He packs up and leaves around noon. Unlike many homeless, AJ does not ask for money, and when you give it to him, he thanks you in a somewhat personalized way. In subsequent visits, I learn that he spends most of his time in the Tenderloin. He says he does not do drugs and he likes vodka. He also likes energy drinks. He says he gets various tents and bikes on the street and he sells them as well. AJ says if he can get a job, he can get off the street. I hope he remains safe and finds circumstances that moderate his paranoia. 6 months before COVID, I started a practice to become more conscious in my dreaming. To dream well, I needed to feel safe as my hearing and imagined boundaries dissolved as I fell into sleep. Yet before COVID, the streets were noisy. My frosted glass wall was a multimedia screen. I could ignore the sounds and shadows on the other side of my glass walls. That was the outside. With COVID, the neighborhood became dead quiet throughout the evening. I could be awoken by the slightest noise, evoking a slight fear, a compulsion to find out what was going on. I assumed that everything outside was, or should be, benign. Now I try to hear and look at the surveillance cameras closely to see if I understand what is going on. I now see that a bang on my door can be someone carrying flowers who needs to loosen something on his shoes. A bang on my window can be a bird diving directly into my window after alighting from a nearby tree with its pals. And a bang on my window can be a fellow pissed off with my building. And screams outside from a tent at 5 a.m. can be AJ. From 2 years of looking at the surveillance cameras, I am a bit wiser. I see better and feel more compassion for folks on the street. Yet I still value locked doors, beefed up locked windows, and a good security system and surveillance cameras. At the beginning of COVID, my area changed from a neighborhood of just frosted glass windows to a neighborhood that included plywood, as stores and offices closed up for an unknown future. During lockdown, a local place that rented out objects for office and apartment staging started playing with their window display. But as of spring 2022, life is coming back, and the streets are busier day and night. Many of the scenes found in this documentary are vanishing in the background. Since its inception in the late 1840s, San Francisco has been a mecca for folks seeking their fortunes or freedoms denied in other parts of the nation or world. Throughout its history, every decade or so, new kinds of younger people enter the city and often upset those who moved in previously. The city is a mecca for young people of a wide variety of skin colors and ethnicities for whom moving to San Francisco is a natural outcome of their expectations and educations. The city's cheaper rents now don't hurt. And the city is a mecca for young people of a variety of sexual and gender identities who have wanted to live in the city since their teenagehood for its expected freedoms. As a side note, the veteran reappeared in the doorway for a weekend in February 2022. He spent the COVID period in several local shelters. He wanted some time back out in the open air, but someone stole his sleeping bag. I noticed that he has not been back since. And San Francisco is also a recent mecca for people with high incomes who have their home in San Francisco yet think nothing of traveling for a week or more to another country to work online from home. Opiate and fentanyl addiction and death are a nationwide problem. The great irony is that from 2020 through 2021, San Francisco has been one of the most highly vaccinated and pandemic-conscious cities in California. It is striking that in this city, more people have died from drug, and in particular fentanyl overdoses, than from COVID-19 itself. Not all these overdoses were homeless folk, and not all occurred in the Tenderloin and South of Market. Within Northern California, San Francisco has also become a mecca for people seeking fentanyl.